The first of our three fiction readers is Gwendolyn Ensz, who is double majoring in English and Christian ministry at Southern Wesleyan University. She started creating stories in her mind before she can remember and hasn't stopped since. She writes under the name Gwendolyn Grayson.
Windways and Winding Ways by Gwendolyn G. Ensz. I think we're here. Chris lifted his head from the window as the car pulled off the road onto a thin stretch of grass. The engine's purr cut off with the ignition, headlights slowly fading into darkness, leaving them with nothing but stars, a half-moon, and flashlights. The blonde agent, Jean Townford, was checking over her weapons again. Considering this was the third time she had done so, it seemed reflexive, a reassuring routine. Percival Stanton, the other agent, looked back at him with piercing blue eyes. "You ready, Vordur?" Chris nodded, unlacing thin-looking arms from the backpack he had been hugging to his chest. He didn't know why he had brought it. It wasn't like he had seriously thought he was going to have time to do biology homework while out on his internship. Letting the bag fall to the hatchback's floor, he grabbed his baseball bat from the seat beside him, rubbing a finger over the wards and spells etched into the dented, scratched-up steel surface. Not quite as polished as the agents with their rim locks, but it was his, and he knew how to use it. He hopped out of the car into the winter night, pulling on his gloves. The safety vest issued him by the Corporation of Extra-Normal Creatures and Activities was already on, under his coat. Either because the dimension or the country they were from was colder than his, the two other Senka agents didn't bother with winter apparel, just the vests. "Any last questions you want to ask before we get this circus on the move?" Townford said, eyeing him from head to toe appraisingly. Chris shook his head, ignoring the odd phrase. Instead, he focused on not nervously bouncing on the balls of his feet. The car door clunked closed behind Stanton. He placed his crossbow on the still-warm car hood, holstering his rimlock. "Why don't you go over the key points one last time, just to be sure?" Chris nodded. Subject, Windway. Classification unspecified due to a lack of confirmed data. Draws in its prey via mind affectation, sending it in spirals until they're close enough for an attack. Signs to look out for include general haziness or a strong urge to keep moving, repeated landmarks passed, and sometimes a low rhythmic whistle, which has historically been associated with the Windway. Key point to attack is the eyes. Extent of capabilities unknown. Mission, termination, not extraction, since it's developed a taste for eating humans. Both of them nodded, Townford smiling encouragingly. "Excellent summary," Stanton added, looking up from last-second calibrations. "You've clearly done your research." Spells glimmered briefly along his crossbow. It's not often I get to deal with something from outside my South Carolina," he said, "or, this dimension, not counting ghosts and Vionons." He bit his lip. "Stop babbling." Townford chuckled. "I keep forgetting you guys have supernaturals here. Anyway, are you sure you don't want any extra weaponry?" Chris shook his head. He was aware how ridiculous his baseball bat looked, but he wanted to be familiar with something on this trip. Too many unknowns already. The trio started down the trail without further chit-chat. Chris hunched into his coat a little more, zipping the collar all the way up, glancing enviously at the much lighter-clad Senka agents. Branches reached for him. Ducking, he dogged Townford's heels, mildly impressed at how she managed to not snag her long ponytail on twigs. The two agents moved with a skill and a soundlessness that surprised him. Traditional wardens, like his family, insisted that the newcomer Senka agents didn't know a skin trader from a face stealer, much less how to move in a forest. The admittedly few agents he had worked with had done nothing to dispel this idea. Maybe other dimensions departments just had better training, or maybe Stanton and Townford just had more experience. After all, the Windway was astray from D199, their home dimension, and their extensive expertise in that area alone was why they were here. As they moved silently along the narrow path, winding through gray trunks of leafless trees, the two were in constant, unreadable communication. He almost ran into Townford twice, when Stanton paused to further inspect something that Chris couldn't see from his vantage point. But those two always stopped, started, and moved in sync. He wondered if his dad or his grandmother would approve of them. Probably not, he thought ruefully. It doesn't matter how competent they are, they're still Senka. And, as Graham is fond of saying, wardens and them don't mix any more than old skins and new wine. The half-moon gleamed through a latticework of twigs and tree boughs, and they had flashlights, only used when necessary. Those bits of brilliance only highlighted the blackness of everything else. Up ahead, the path split into two. Both sides vanished into darkness, enshrouded in smoke made of shadows. With the same wordless communication, the agents split smoothly. Townford headed right, Stanton motioned him to the left. Hurst followed, stomach uncomfortably light. It was too quiet. The occasional rustled leaf sounded like a grove full of cottonwoods in a windstorm. It was uncanny. The darkness, the silver slivers of light, the utterly windless calm, the silently standing trees, watching them as if alive beyond a mere biological definition, sent frozen shivers up Chris's spine, colder than the ice choking the streamlets he stepped over. He wondered distantly if those led to the lake. They only needed to follow the path. Hurst kept his ears open and his eyes towards his boots, away from the rough-barked sentinels haphazardly lining the way to a destination he could neither see nor guess, away from the menacing obscurity of night. Barely avoiding stubbing his toe on a root, Chris's mind wandered towards the last bit of reading he hoped to finish before tomorrow's test, and the assignment due next class, and he still had to check next week's schedule, a worryingly foggy memory. Forcing his mind back to the present, he tried to ignore the sudden feeling of helplessness nagging at his breath. He was here now. He had to work on this. Something thin and light enveloped his face with a sticking sensation. He froze, biting back a yell of alarm, not wanting to startle either Stanton or any nearby creatures. His heart hammered, nerves on edge. Forcefully, he sucked in a breath. With a sudden burst of realization, he realized that A, it was a spider web, B, the spider was not in it, and C, he was walking in the woods. Spider webs were everywhere, so he should have been paying attention. He doubled over, so relieved he felt moronic. Honestly, why am I even here? It was past midnight, meaning he had only slept 4 hours out of the last 24. He had a test tomorrow for a major he was no longer sure he wanted to pursue. It was freezing. He was trailing a beast from another dimension with 2 people he didn't know and who frankly didn't need him, and an internship for a career he didn't know if he should follow. Serving a corporation his sternly traditional family despised. This, all a few short months away from having to make new decisions for the entire course of his future. Decisions full of unknowns as dimly murked as the trail in front of him. Meanwhile, he was carrying a mythical baseball bat, and he had spiderwebs all over his face. Some hysterical corner of his mind wanted to burst out laughing. He didn't. Instead, he cleared the web from his face, moved forward. He had to keep going, after all. Now was neither the time nor place to stop, and... Where's Stanton? His heartbeat just settled down, leapt back up again with extra espresso-fueled fervor. Whirling towards the trail behind him, Chris snapped up his flashlight and turned it on, scanning all the surrounding area. No one was in sight. The pounding of his heart rang dizzily in his aching brain. Agent Stanton? He hissed. He ran the flashlight all around him, back up towards the trail in front of him. Only bare dirt and roots. He knelt down to the ground, searched for footprints. The frozen ground offered nothing. Agent Stanton! Stanton was supervising him during the hunt. He wouldn't leave him, right? It might be better to wait here. Chris shook his head. No, he had just fallen behind. He could catch up again. He quickened his pace, forgetting any spiderwebs. Maybe Stanton was just around the bend. There was only one trail here. The split had been behind them, so why was there another one? It loomed ahead with an ominous twinge of déjà vu, identical to the last fork. They had chosen the left path, right? Chris knew he had to keep moving, had to keep up with... He ground to a halt, skin crawling. To his left was a low sound like a whistle, rising and falling in a slow, steady pattern. He hadn't realized that he had continued towards the split in the path until the whistle stopped. Stanton? He said again, not daring to raise his voice above a whisper. The branches loomed overhead, rustling and scratching in a sudden breeze, like the murmur of hoarse ghosts. He wasn't sure what was worse, that he felt piercingly alone in this world of stifling shadows and living trees, or the fact that he knew with a bone-deep certainty that he was not. Chris clutched his baseball bat, the rubber grip of comforting familiarity even through his glove. This was fine. He had faced worse before. Closing his eyes, he fought to concentrate, think through this. Keep going, he told himself. The original plan was to follow the Windway's trail and engage it that way, if we couldn't find its lair before then. But I don't know the way. I don't know how to fight this. I barely even know what it looks like. Frosted air singed his lungs. He focused on that, forcing the sudden edge of panic from his mind. Keep going, along the Windway's path, one step at a time. The pull to keep moving tugged at his mind, even as he debated. Running a gloved finger along the length of his baseball bat, he stepped forward, following the Windway's direction. Worrying about his future would have to wait until he knew he'd be alive to see one. The low whistle sounded again, rhythmic and warbling, like a mourning dove trilling through violin strings, the impetus to move strengthened with the sound. Shadows cloaking the path lurked more foreboding than ever. Every now and then he would swing his flashlight around, but there was nothing to be seen except towering trees and sparse brush and the chancy, never-ending trail. No sign of Stanton, no sound but his own feet and the occasional low call of the windway. Which was perhaps the worst part. How was there no other sound, no nightbirds, no insects, no... His coat caught on a bush. Again, he ground to a halt, clenching his teeth. A glance around revealed that he had long since stumbled off the path. He was getting closer. The call chirred, louder this time. Digging in his feet, Chris refused to move, reluctant to get any closer to the unseen thing. Cracking, creaking, a branch shuddered under a heavy weight. He whirled in place, tapping on the bat's handle to activate the engraved glyphs. Nothing in sight. And yet, the underbrush crunched, thudding under impact. What had the file said? Extent of capabilities unknown? Great. He gulped, vision blurring. He needed a sign, a glimpse. Something slammed him into a tree, the safety vest whirring to life and throwing a protective shield around him in a glimmer of silver dust. Gasping for breath, he tried to stay upright on legs of chaff. A second unseen thing smashed against his side and hurled him into the frozen mud of a nearby stream. 2 sets of claw marks glowed on the silver shield. A heavy, smothering presence fell over him, pinning him to the ground, blocking out the twig-woven ceiling. Gasped breath clattered in his throat. Gritting his teeth, Chris slashed upwards with all the force he could muster. There was a shriek, and the weight lifted. He still couldn't breathe. Wildly, Chris swung the bat again at the empty air. A burst of force swirling out in a shower of copper, carving a swathe through the forest in front of him. The mythe blade bit into the tree beside him with little effort despite his shaking hands. There was a deafening silence, except for the high-pitched whine of the mythe blade shimmering around the bat. Nothing moved, stillness as painful as his throbbing head grating against him. He still could see nothing. Did that mean it had worked, or had he missed it altogether? Then, rustling in the dried boughs above him. Chris shut his eyes. He couldn't trust what he could see, couldn't make a move based on that. Waiting, listening, fighting to hear the quiet sounds above the rushing of his own blood like a riptide in his ears. The creature moved towards him. A bush, still clinging to its long dead leaves, rattled to his left. Chris acted instantly, jerking the mythe blade forward. Another scream, another silence, fostering the panic of anticipation. Chris opened his eyes, unable to stand it. Something moved, something hurtling towards him. He raised his bat defensively as he took a step backward, slipped, crashed groundward. Steel eyes glowered in a hazed silhouette against the waxing moon. A cold smell, terror. Teeth, claws, ripping at a shield that felt like a glass coffin. A sharp twang and impact he felt through the body on top of him. Collapsing warm weight pressing him further into the mud. Vordor, are you okay? Chris rolled, kicked the thing away from him in a burst of adrenaline, scrambled away. Eyes still wide, he looked up to see Stanton, crossbow already reloaded, racing towards him. Shooting the second bolt into a mass of fur and limbs, he held out a hand for Chris. Are you all right? All in one piece? Chris nodded, pulling himself up. Yes, sir. He followed, feeling the bile of fear as it began to dawn on him that he was still alive. Stanton heaved an enormous sigh, running his hand through his hair. You scared me half to death with that disappearing stunt. You're as bad as Jean. He grinned in relief. I mean that as both a complaint and a compliment. You did a number on the Windway by yourself. He pointed to the thing on the ground, a mass of mud, dark fur, and blood, with 2 crossbow bolts sticking out of it. A rank smell Chris hadn't noticed before made him wrinkle his nose. He nudged it with his toe. The long body flipped over, thick furred tail still twitching. Is that it? Chris asked, half disbelieving. He could see 2 deep cuts from his mythe blade, one across its unnaturally huge eyes. But it was smaller than he had imagined. The 6-limbed body was smaller than a coyote. Stanton nodded. You always think they'll be bigger when you can't get a decent visual. Are all windways that way? Windways, wherries, leechers? You'll find a lot of things seem harder to handle than they actually are. Unknowns always bring more fear than they merit. Chris chewed his lip thoughtfully, mind spinning through dozens of answers and questions. How do you deal with unknowns, then? You always shoot them with a crossbow? Chris could feel Stanton staring at him searchingly. Only works occasionally, he said slowly. Otherwise, you take it one step at a time, dealing with what you do know, and what you don't will reveal itself in due time. Work with what's in front of you at the moment, right? Exactly. Stanton clapped him on the shoulder, grin returning. For a new intern, you did a fantastic job. I certainly did worse on my first few field tests. He took a deep breath. Now, let's find Jean and get back to your dorm. Chris smiled, feeling lighter than he had in a while. Yes, sir. I need to get some sleep before my test tomorrow. The woods were still plunged in as nebulous a darkness as ever. But he noticed, as he helped Stanton drag the Windway's carcass back to the car, that there was just enough light to see by.